Good morning, Herstory gang. How are we? I am finally doing your next episode, which is Nellie Bly. I'm coming to you from my bed today, because I'm in the middle of quite a horrific fibro flare up. Not had one this bad for a very long time, and I know you're wondering, Emma, why does your hair look so magnificent if you're having a day in bed in pain? The answer is I sleep with my hair in a plait. So morning comes and I just literally undo my plait and brush it through with my fingers, and I have lovely curly locks. So that's the answer to that question. It's not like witchcraft or anything. It's just a plait. So anyway, without further ado, welcome to my boudoir. And we're talking today about Nellie Bly, journalist, world traveller, and advocate for mental ill health, among many other things. As with everything that I do with Herstory, the more I researched this woman, the more I realised how freaking badass she was. And I have a newfound love and respect for Nellie Bly. So without further ado, I shall launch in. And here is Nellie Bly. Born Elizabeth Jane Cochrane on the 5th of May 1864 at Cochrane's Mills in Pennsylvania, which is now Armstrong County, Pennsylvania. Her father, Michael Cochrane, started as a labourer and mill worker before buying the local mill and most of the land surrounding his family farmhouse. He later became a postmaster, a merchant, and associate justice. He had 10 children by his first wife, Catherine, and 5 more, including Nellie, by his second wife, Mary Jane Kennedy. Whoop, for the Kennedys. As a young girl, she was often called Pinky because she frequently wore that colour, which it was what I used to call my little sister when she was little as well. So this video is for you, Pinky. Her father died in 1870/1871 when she was about 6 or 7 years old, and 10 years later, after separating from her abusive second husband, her mum moved the family to Pittsburgh. While in Pittsburgh, a newspaper column entitled "What Girls Are Good For" caught young Nellie's attention. It was reporting that women were basically only good for birthing children and keeping house. So Elizabeth wrote a strongly worded response under the pseudonym Lonely Orphan Girl, and the editor, George Madden, was blown away by her passion and her conviction and ran an advert to try and find the identity of Little Orphan Girl. When Elizabeth introduced herself, he offered her the opportunity to write a piece for the newspaper, and her first article for the Dispatch was entitled "The Girl Puzzle," which was about how divorce affected women and called for reform of divorce laws, obviously having just been through a nasty divorce situation with her mother and her former stepfather. This was something that was very close to Nellie's heart at that point in time. Madden was impressed with her article yet again and offered her a full-time job for the Dispatch. Female journalists at the time used pen names, and the editor chose Nellie Bly for Elizabeth. Bly focused her early work for the Dispatch on the lives of working women, going undercover, highlighting the crappy conditions for female factory workers. Then the newspaper received complaints because of this outspoken woman who was doing all this undercover journalism. So she was relegated to covering fashion, society, and gardening. Quickly dissatisfied, Nellie travelled to Mexico to serve as a foreign correspondent, aged just 21, determined to do something no girl had ever done before. She spent 6 months reporting the lives and customs of the Mexican people, and later published her dispatches in a book called 6 Months in Mexico. She protested the imprisonment of a local journalist for criticizing the Mexican government, which was then a dictatorship under Porfirio Diaz. which caused her to be threatened with arrest, prompting her to leave the country pretty sharpish. Once safely home, she publicly denounced Diaz as being a tyrant. So she's back in New York and she's burdened again by back in Pittsburgh. And she's burdened again by writing about theatre and arts and boring stuff. So Nellie leaves the Pittsburgh Dispatch in 1887 and goes to New York City. Penniless, after 4 months, she talked her way into the offices of Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper, the New York World, and took on an undercover assignment for which she agreed to fake insanity to investigate claims of brutality and neglect at the women's lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island. Now, this is what I knew Nellie for, but there is so much more to her story, so I'm just going to go talk about this a little bit, and then in fun facts I'll expand upon it because I'm eager to get on to the rest of Nellie's life and the amazing things she achieved. It was a relatively easy feat to get yourself admitted to the asylum. She checked herself into a temporary lodging house, stayed up all night so that she had a kind of wide-eyed look about her, and began making accusations that the other boarders were insane. She refused to go to bed, caused a ruckus, eventually scared enough of the boarders that the police were called and took her to the nearby courthouse where she had to undergo an examination by a police officer, a judge and a doctor before being taken to Blackwell's Island. So she managed to fool them all. Whilst in the asylum, Bly experienced the heinous conditions firsthand, and after only 10 days, Bly was released from the asylum at the newspaper's request. So they came and blew the whole lid on the whole thing and got her out, basically. Her report was later published in a book called 10 Days in a Madhouse. 6 months in Mexico, 10 Days in a Madhouse. Which caused an absolute media storm, prompting asylums to implement reforms and catapulting her to fame. In 1888, aged 24, Bly suggested to her editor that she make a trip around the world, attempting to turn the fictional Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne into fact for the first time. A year later, at 9:40 a.m. on November the 14th, 1889, and with 2 days' notice, she boarded the Augusta Victoria steamer and began her journey. She only took the dress she was wearing, an overcoat, a couple of pairs of underwear, and money in a bag tied around her neck. The New York newspaper Cosmopolitan had sponsored its own reporter, Elizabeth Bisland, to beat Nellie Bly, travelling the opposite way around the world and starting the same day. But Bly didn't really care about her. She was more interested in doing her own thing and saying her own goals, and she was like, yeah, okay, whatever. Nellie suffered with terrible seasickness and slept for most of the time at sea, bless her. Having experienced seasickness, I can sympathise. I went through England, France, where she actually met Jules Verne, the Suez Canal, Ceylon, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Japan. She sent short progress reports via submarine cable networks, and readers tried to guess her arrival time at her next stop to the second. Longer dispatches had to go by post, so they took a little bit longer. She travelled using steamships and existing railways, which caused occasional setbacks, particularly in the Asian leg of her race. During these stops, she visited a leper colony in China, and she bought a monkey in Singapore. She landed in San Francisco on the RMS Oceanic on January 21st, 2 days behind schedule, and she finally arrived back in New Jersey by private train on January the 25th, 1890 at 3:51 p.m. It had taken her a total of 72 days. To circumnavigate the globe almost single-handedly. For most of her journey, she was alone. She didn't have a chaperone. She just did it by herself. Bisland arrived in New York 4.5 days later. Shame. Bly's journey was a world record, though it wasn't a record for very long because Jules Francis Train did it in 60 days in 1892. But that was his third attempt. So, took him 3 times to beat her. In later life, Bly was an inventor, patenting steel barrel oil drums. So in 1895, she married millionaire manufacturer Robert Seaman. She was 31 and he was 73 when they married. Due to her husband's failing health, she left journalism and succeeded Robert as head of the ironclad manufacturing company. And then while she was there, she patented the steel barrel oil drum, milk cans, stacking garbage can, and for a time was one of the leading women industrialists. But unfortunately, her negligence, her failure to see what was going on within her company, and embezzlement by a factory manager resulted in the ironclad manufacturing company going bankrupt. After the company went bankrupt in 1911 and Robert had died already in 1904, Nellie returned to journalism, writing stories on Europe's Eastern Front during World War I. She was the first woman to visit the war zone between Serbia and Austria. Whilst there, she was arrested and mistaken for a British spy. She also covered the Women's Suffrage Parade of 1913 under the headline, "Suffragists are men's superiors." She was campaigning for women's rights to vote by 1920. Nellie died of pneumonia at St. Mark's Hospital in New York City in 1922 at the age of 57. She was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. So here are our fun facts. Nellie Bly has inspired a Broadway musical, a movie, The Adventures of Nellie Bly, a one-woman show, a comic book, 2 episodes of Drunk History, a horror novel, a murder mystery novel, the film 10 Days in a Madhouse, which is a short biographical film that came out earlier this year, starring Christina Ricci, who plays her. And that is called Escaping the Madhouse, the Nellie Bly story, so keep a lookout for that. She had an amusement park named after her in Brooklyn, a Pennsylvania Railroad Express train named after her, a New York Press Club award, a board game, Round the World with Nellie Bly, which came out in 1890, an ice cream parlour, a restaurant, a fireboat, and even a kaleidoscope shop. Just let that sink in. What would drive someone to go, I'm going to open a kaleidoscope shop? Lord knows. In 1998, she was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame. She was one of 4 journalists honoured with a US postage stamp in 2002 as part of a Women in Journalism set. The character of Lana Winters, played by Sarah Paulson in American Horror Story Asylum, is inspired by Bly's asylum experience, for any American Horror Story fans out there. 10 Days in a Madhouse. Okay, so we'll go into a little bit more detail here. She was examined by several doctors. One called her positively demented and another called her a hopeless case. And the head of Bellevue Hospital pronounced her undoubtedly insane. Once admitted, Bly immediately abandoned any pretense at all at mental illness and went back to acting exactly as she would normally. Her pleas to be released were interpreted as signs of mental illness. The nurses beat patients, served rotten food and undrinkable water. Dangerous patients were tied together with ropes and they were made to sit all day on hard benches. Waste was all around them in their eating places. Rats infested the place. She wrote of her experiences, "What, accepting torture, would produce insanity quicker than this treatment?" The bathwater was freezing cold. Buckets of it were poured over their heads whilst attendants scrubbed at them. The patients had to share towels despite some having open wounds, boils and skin infections. After only 10 days, the newspaper secured her release. Bly's report prompted a grand jury to launch its own investigation with Bly's assistance, resulting in an $850,000 increase in the budget of the Department of Public Charities and Corrections. Better living and sanitary conditions were imposed, more rigorous examinations, more nourishing meals, translators for foreign patients, and the nurses and physicians who had committed acts of abuse were fired. Bly was only 23 when she was admitted and was dubbed the Girl Detective by readers. After the death of Nellie's father, she had been forced to drop out of school due to the family's financial situation. So Nellie Bly actually never completed her education. She'd initially wanted to become a teacher. So there we go. One of the best journalists in the world didn't complete her formal education. In July, it was announced that Nellie would be getting her own monument on Roosevelt Island, which is really cool, where the asylum used to be. The piece is to be unveiled in spring 2020 and has a budget of $500,000. So can't wait to see that. Very exciting. Bly also wrote exposés of baby selling rackets, harsh conditions of female factory workers by going undercover. Some people say she's the mother of undercover journalism. Hard to argue with that. At just 14, Elizabeth had to testify at the divorce trial of her mother and second husband and gave a candid attack of the abuse she'd witnessed and his drunkenness. This marriage went on to influence her writing on divorce law. It took some persuading for her to get the go-ahead for her round-the-world trip. Women simply did not travel alone without a chaperone or a protector, and it was argued a woman would carry too much baggage and it would detain her in making rapid changes. Plus, you only speak English, so there is no point in talking about it. No one but a man can do it. To which she replied, "Very well, start the man, and I'll start the same day for some other newspaper. And I'll beat him," I think she said as well. So it took a year for her to finally convince them to agree. But she did it, and she did it on her own, and she set a new world record. So only a man can do it. Nope, sorry. Direct quote from Nellie, which I absolutely love. "I always have a comfortable feeling that nothing is impossible if one applies a certain amount of energy in the right direction." Love that. So that's Nellie Bly, trailblazer who refused to accept no for an answer. She was a keen feminist and seemed to ace almost everything she put her mind to. She was courageous and never let the fact she was a woman stand in her way. And I'm going to leave you with a final quote from her. "I said I could, and I would, so I did." Thank you, Nellie, for all the hard work that you did in undercover investigative journalism. Thank you for paving the way for asylum reform, and thank you for caring about the plight of women and pushing women's rights further at a time when it really wasn't acceptable behaviour for a woman to be doing. So thank you very much, Nellie. I hope you have enjoyed Nellie's story. I will be posting this, and then I will be popping a new poll up on the Facebook page for next week's episode. So head on over to the Herstory Girls Facebook page and click on who you want to see in next week's episode. Please go and have a look at my Patreon account, which is also called the Herstory Girls. I'll be uploading some cool exclusive stuff there for you. And don't forget to subscribe and like and comment and all that stuff, and share and tell your friends all about Herstory. There we go. Said my bit. Thank you very much for joining me for Nellie Bly, and I will see you next week with a new awesome kick-ass Herstory lady. Have a wonderful week. Mwah!